Guitarristas, ¿sabéis cuál es la diferencia real entre un Kemper y, por ejemplo, un Line 6 Helix? ¿O por qué son tan famosas ahora las respuestas de impulso y en qué se diferencian de un simulador de altavoces de toda la vida? ¿Y por qué los multiefectos de los 90 todos parecía que sonaban pequeños y metidos dentro de una caja? Pues bueno, esas son todas las preguntas que he aprovechado a hacerles a Eric Klein y Adrian, dos expertos del Line 6, que se han prestado. Yo les escribí un correo para ver si aceptarían responder estas preguntas tanto de Line 6 como de otras marcas y explicarnos pues todas esas pequeñas cosas y muchas más que nos van a hacer entender mucho mejor los multiefectos, saber lo que pasa ahí dentro y también tener un poco más de criterio a la hora de decidir si lo que estamos comprando hace o no exactamente lo mismo que otro producto que tenemos al lado. Vamos con la entrevista, os aviso que es larga y un poco técnica, pero vais a aprender muchas cosas.
Eric, Ben, thank you so much for your time and being here. Let's start with the first question. How different is a home computer from the computer that's inside a multi-effects pedal board?
It depends on the multi-effects pedal board. There are fewer differences than there were 10 years ago. So a lot of the less expensive, less sophisticated products are just using the same ARM processors that you're going to find in, not the same, but similar ARM processors you might find in a Chromebook or something like that, or in a Mac M1, like similar type of architecture. There are limitations to ARM if you're trying to do specific types of number crunching, which is why we still, for at least the flagship products that we work on, we're still embracing dedicated DSPs like Sharks, and other companies like Texas Instruments make dedicated DSPs. But there's still major advantages to those DSPs. And some of our less expensive products that need to do less, say, like Pod Express, which we just announced, or HX1, they run on ARM. Catalyst amps, they run on ARM processors as well. They just don't need to do as much as something like Helix or HX. Some of our products do have, flagships do have ARMs in them to do, like file management or redrawing the LCDs, running the LEDs, things like that. So so there is some overlap with the computer industry. The big thing, though, is that computer industry, they are selling, hundreds of millions of products a year. And so it's heavily commoditized. And so they're able to buy, parts pricing and at costs a week that nobody can compete with. And we're Yamaha. We're the biggest we're the biggest musical manufacturer in the entire world. So even then, there's no way that we can compete with Microsoft or Apple or Dell or any of those guys.
And are home computers generally more powerful in terms of specifications because they have to do like many diverse things compared to a multi-effects?
Generally, yeah. I mean, that's why. When you're dealing with any type of desktop or even mobile stuff, like in your phone, it's all sort of designed to be multi-purpose. Whereas if we're going to put a dedicated DSP in something, it's the speed and the efficiency and the power consumption is designed specifically for that function.
Okay.
And I'm not an engineer. I'm not a DSP engineer, and Ben dabbles with DSP engineering, but for the most part, that's my understanding on it, at least. So
my understanding is like on a home computer, that's designed to run everything, all applications. They have to build one layer that works with the core op things of the computer, and then all the applications that people run have to interface with that layer. When you're making an effects processor, you just are like, it's just running specifically on the components. You don't have to have that intermediary where it has to be able to do a large number of things. All it has to do is this one thing, and when you have the one thing being done, you can do it much more efficiently and faster, or with less latency and quicker processing. So it's you can maybe use something less powerful than a home computer, but get more powerful audio processing out of it because you don't have to worry about any of the other stuff that a home computer has to do.
Absolutely. And I guess in a home computer, you see what happens on the screen, but there are lots of things happening at the same time that you don't see. Does that happen too in a multi-effect? There are lots of things that the user doesn't see, for instance?
Yeah, it's not nearly as much as what you might see in a Mac or PC, but I mean, there are, it's constantly going back and grabbing information from the MCU and shuttling it to the DSP back and forth. It's not entirely transparent, but there's not a ton of stuff happening. It's mainly data and audio and like shuttling back and forth between different cores or different DSPs.
Going deeper into what people understand. When I mean people, I mean the guitar players, bedroom players, or live players, it doesn't matter. They heard about modeling, component modeling, and profiling. Could you explain to us what's the difference between those two approaches? Okay.
So profiling is when someone comes up with an algorithmic way to take an output signal and record the input signal, and it has, gets processed through an amp. And it's a way where someone it's usually a pretty complex thing. It's not just some simple equation. But the idea is that you set an amp to one setting that you like, you put a signal into it, you record it, and then that can make some, non-linear, I don't want to say model, non-linear profile, I guess, that amplifier. So when you then put in your guitar signal, the output will, then represent what would come out of the whole signal chain of, amplifier, speaker cabinet, even things like mic preamp. And component modeling, and the way line 6 does it, we are taking the circuit, we're looking at the circuit of the amp, both visually, like in a schematic, but also physically in the amp. And we don't actually take it apart, but we can put probes like inside the amp, and we can measure the differences in sound as the signal goes through the signal path. So what ends up happening is, you have, the amp model can actually be considered like, anywhere between 15 to 30 small changes of sound, analogous to what happens when the signal passes through the actual physical amplifier. So we measure up to, like, say, the first gain stage. It's like, got 32 decibels gain, and this kind of EQ happens to it. So we match that. We measure the drive knob at a bunch of different places, and then we can actually then mimic the gain amount change from the drive knob and how the tonality changes. So a component level model is more like many different changes, and it just replicates the entire circuit of the amplifier, but in a digital domain.
Okay.
And that's how I feel it gets a real, not that profiling sounds great. Lots of people use it and to good results, but I think being able to adjust tone knobs and drive knobs and have the same thing happen in the model that is actually happening in the amplifier, but just in the digital world has an interactivity and a tactile touch sensitivity that is very satisfying to me.
So I guess that when you make component modeling, you actually take measures of each part. I mean, physically you I've seen a video of you using like two metal pieces, and you get in contact with that part and you get conclusions of what that does, okay?
Yes.
But when you do profiling, you have like a whole thing that you don't know much about, maybe because it's an entire chain of preamp, microphone, blah, blah, blah. You cannot take the separate parts again.
Once you do a profile, I'm not sure exactly what's happening on the super high-end profiling, but yeah, once you take a capture, you're kind of getting that one sound. Mm-hmm. And you can't really remove a section of that sound. I know they do things where now they're trying to have profiles that have multiple gain stages in them, and then they can insert volume and tone controls in the middle, so you get something that is representative to where you would have volume and tone changes within a guitar amp. But I don't really know how that works. It's kind of a black box. It just depends on how you want to work. I feel like people who want to have the benefits of digital amplifiers, but already have their library of physical amplifiers and like, I'm going to use this sound, I'm going to use this sound, I'm going to use this sound. Profiling works well for them. Or like a touring guitarist where it's like, I can set up all my rigs at home, I can get profiles, and then I can go out on tour and I can use the exact sounds in the studio, and they're not tweaking them. And then players who are more experimentals, who are on kind of like a sound journey, who want to try a bunch of different things, who really want to create interactive guitar rigs that they can swap out models, much like they would swap out a pedal on a pedal board or, an amp. They do enjoy the component modeling, like how things are done in Helix, maybe a little bit.
After learning this, I think I'm a component modeling guy.
Yes, we love all gear. I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong. It's just whichever tool, works best for you.
Okay. Let's go back to hardware software thing. If you had to pick one, which one you prefer? Powerful hardware with a decent software, or a super strong software with a decent hardware?
Personally, software.
Okay.
I mean, my main rig is Helix native based, but this is my rig. It's a studio. So I grew up, in studios and recording and producing, and so that's really comfortable for me. It makes a lot of sense to have a computer screen with an audio interface and a dedicated, preamp that I can inject in there. And I'm actually using Helix Rack as my input device into Logic with, Helix Native and some other plugins. But that's normal for me. But that is not normal for most people.
Okay.
So I would say for most people, they want to turn a knob. They want to be able to flip on a switch and have sounds right away. They want to make sure that they're not constantly fighting latency. I had to put a lot of analog gear in here just to get the latency down to where I was comfortable playing. So where I could actually have a song playing and I can play and I'm not constantly fighting that weird lag that's always inherent in any type of software system. But I do have a setup where I can hit one button, I can plug into Helix Rack, and it gets routed directly to the speaker, so I don't have to turn on the computer at all. So if I'm just playing, I never turn on the computer. But I rarely just play to play. I'm always playing for purpose. I'm playing to record a song, and so my computer is always on. So, but if you're playing for enjoyment, or if you're playing with other people, having to lug a computer to the practice space, while doable, I wouldn't imagine trying to accomplish that. Although some do with great success, that doesn't sound fun to me at all.
And when you're designing a new modular, what comes first? Deciding the hardware the software will run into, or is it the other way around? You design the software and then pick the hardware that will, make it work?
It's generally the second. It's we have what we call TRDs, or technical requirement documents, and they're very, very elaborate and very deep. Imagine if we had an owner's manual that was like super hardcore, like 10 times the length of the owner's manual, that gets in every single detail. This particular function happens on button press down. This function happens on button press up. This happens when you hold these two buttons. Here's a string of scripts that happens. Here are the various states of different icons on the screen. It gets super, super detailed. And I'm not a hardware. I don't design. I design layouts of hardware, but I don't design DSPs. I don't design electrical layouts, any of that stuff. And so then the DSP and the electrical team, they take a look at the requirements from the document, and they're like, what did you do? Really expensive to make. And then there's some back and forth, and we're like, well, okay, so what's the stuff that's going to make it really expensive? We're like, well, if you were to get rid of this, we could make it cheaper. I go, okay, well, let's talk about, well, can we keep this? And if we did this, and if we moved this around, and if we did it in this way instead, could we use this chip instead of this chip? And they're like, yeah, but that's going to take 3 extra months of work. So there's a lot of give and take, but for the most part, you design what you want the box to do, and then the team figures out how to do it within the time, effort, and price constraints.
Okay.
And it's never easy, but it's always fun.
And when you start to get the machine making some sounds, which is your priority, if there is one? It is your priority the studio monitors and FR system, or do you work with an amp? And then how do you make a good compromise of those two so different worlds?
Well, it starts out actually on test equipment. So we have to make sure it's working, and we're constantly looking at the actual audio streams coming in, making sure that the noise specs are there, that the dynamic range is there, that all of that stuff is working. But once that system is up and running, we try to actually be running the hardware as much as possible. So there'll be early prototypes, and we're constantly improving that as things go. So the noise specs get better, the dynamic range specs get better. I use focals here. Ben, do you have Atoms in the studio? I forget.
No, I mean, I just have Mackie 824s, which I've used for years and years, so I know them. To answer the question, I think it's probably listened to on studio monitors first. But the way that we do the modeling, the amps are modeled without cabinets. I mean, they're modeled with cabinets attached, but we can capture the sound without the cabinet being there. So if you just turn off all the things that are cabinet, microphone that come, kind of after the amp, you can then plug it into a power amp and get the sound of an amplifier and then hook it up to a guitar speaker cabinet. So it's kind of like if we model for the studio in mind, you can then remove to get back to the sound of the guitar amp.
So I guess one of the advantages of making component modeling is exactly that it's not necessarily something for studio or for live, because it's going to work well with either.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting.
With hooking my Helix up to like a big solid state power amp and then guitar cabinets, just because I like standing in the room with guitar cabinets. But, when it comes time to actually record, I usually work quick and dirty. I have the Helix and I'm plugging it right into an audio interface recording. And then many times I don't even save the sound. It's like, that's it. That sounds great now. Like, I'm done. It's like, I almost treat it like I'm using an analog rig in an old studio, but it's just all done in a tiny little thing like, this on the floor.
Yeah. We have our own it's a stomp here too, because we use it a lot. Like you can see, we have the blue one. This is a splendid tool. I think its size and how powerful as an interface it is, it's amazing. Okay. Yeah, I love it. Okay, so I have a few questions about what is more difficult to implement, and I'm going to mention a small list of things, and you have to tell me, it's difficult, it's not difficult, all that. Having dual amps on a preset.
So it's fairly straightforward so long as you don't run out of DSP, because the amps use the most.
Is it hard to implement true bypass on a multi-effects? You know what I mean? Like, people usually want to use 4cm method and that stuff. Is it hard to have true bypass?
Oh, that's really just kind of an electrical thing. So it's not difficult there's not much involved on the firmware or software design side. I mean, it's one line in the TRDs. It's like, this has to be true bypass. It's wholly appropriate for a product like HX Stomp that's going to be on the pedal board, where if you don't want to use its effects or modeling for a particular song or part of a song, you want it true bypass.
Absolutely.
But something like Helix, it doesn't really make sense because it has so many ins and outs, and you're not going to use it as your distortion pedal. And while you technically could,
as a tuner,
trying to make true bypass kind of sends the wrong message of what we want people to use it for.
Yeah.
So, and there have been products like Fractal's FX8 that had independent true bypass of pre and post sections, which is totally cool. I totally get that. But it's not something that we've implemented, at least not yet. But like DL4R2 and HX Stomp, HX Effects, HX1, they all have true bypass because they're pedal board products, so it's wholly appropriate there.
Absolutely. Being able to load two IRs at the same time, is that difficult?
I mean, it's just kind of like the exact same thing as the amps. Once you design the way that the signal flow can happen, then you can put any effect in any slot in the signal flow, and just so long as you're not running out of memory or DSP processing power, then you can generally do that, right? That sound good, Eric?
Yeah, I mean, I could imagine if the user were to pull in two different IRs from two different developers, and if they weren't phase aligned, you might get some phase cancellation to make it sound thin and weird. But traditionally, if you put in two IRs from the same developer, they're going to be phase aligned at least to each other, so they'll sound good together.
Okay, and having spillover between scenes and presets, is that difficult to implement?
Snapshots, that's not difficult. Presets can be very difficult, but it depends on how you're implementing it.
Okay.
So if you have a Digitech, was it 2101? I forget what it is. What's the Digitech with true spillover, Ben? You remember?
I think it's
like the 2112, 2101, something like that.
Yeah, and the 1101 had it too. I think the gray one, the last that they released. I think
what they do is, and what Helix, the way it works for Helix is, you have the DSP, so you're running two presets simultaneously, and that preset is half the size as a full preset, and you're basically hopping back and forth.
Okay.
That's not difficult. It's not easy to implement. It's difficult to implement, but it seems to make sense. Some other companies they'll have a global type reverb where every preset has the same reverb, and it'll just even though the presets aren't gapless, the reverb will sort of smear over the two, so it sounds a bit more seamless. That is not true spillover, no matter what they say.
I understand.
Some companies, they will sample the audio output of each output block and then duplicate that like a looper, like a very short loop to fill in the gap. That is also not true spillover, but it can improve the perception
of continuity.
Exactly. So there are a bunch of different ways to do it, but the only true way to do true spillover is to, especially if you have something that has lots of swirly things where you switch it and you want all those swirly things to keep going for potentially, who knows, 10 seconds, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to have two presets running simultaneously. So you have to effectively have your DSP.
Wow, it's amazing.
And that's not to say there aren't weird, tricky ways where if you put the onus on the user to sort of manage their DSP carefully, you could probably give them 3/4 of a preset per thing. But then it gets really complicated for the end user, and so we just decided let's just split it in half.
That's so interesting. I'm very passionate about that kind of secrets that people usually don't get access to. For those who don't know, IRs are, the most popular technology right now when it comes to emulating a speaker, okay? So what's the difference between an IR, a modern IR, and a simple equalization like those found in analog speaker simulations that we used to have, like in the 80s maybe?
Well, an IR is
It's sort of a glorified EQ curve, but
it's really an EQ curve that's just implemented by doing, like math over time. To emulate what's going on in an IR with regular EQ curves, you might need something like 20 different filters to really nail the complexity of it. Whereas, like analog style speaker simulations, what do they call it? Like reactive loads, things like that. Those are done with, a fewer number of filters. They can still have great results, but the IR is a much more accurate along the entire frequency range of all the peaks and valleys that are actually occurring within the the measurement of a speaker cabinet or microphone or whatever is in the system that you're creating the IR for.
Mm-hmm.
And Ben, don't quote me, but I believe stuff like the old JMP1s and the Sans amps and even early pods, their cab emulation was effectively just EQ, right?
I think so. I don't know about the pods, but I think like JMP1s, my old Digitech Valve Effects had something like that. It's just, you kind of create a little bump for the speaker resonance. You have some other things, and you have cut off the highs to limit because guitar speakers can't reproduce off the high. So, but in many of them worked pretty well. But it's kind of more like a cartoon drawing of what a speaker cabinet sounds like and an actual recording of what a speaker cabinet sounds like. Yeah.
And also I heard many times that the input section of even multi-effects, not only analog stuff, but also multi-effects is very important. Why do they say that?
I would say for the most thing, the most important thing is just because guitar players are used to hearing their guitar plugged into an amp with a certain impedance load. And that the way that a guitar interacts with that analog circuitry and like the touch sensitivity comes with the impedance load and something that resembles an audio circuit that people plug into, whether it's a distortion box, an amplifier. If you plug it into a low impedance thing like a home stereo, you start losing a lot of high end, you lose touch sensitivity. So the analog, that's the number one reason that the analog input signal for digital effects is very important. Second one is, you want to get it into the digital converter with as little noise as possible. 3, sometimes there's a safety barrier where if you actually distort that analog input signal, you want it to be a pleasant sound. So they'll build in ways for like soft clipping of that analog input circuitry so that if it does distort, it doesn't distort in a harsh way, or it doesn't actually go into digital clipping in the digital unit, which can sound really pretty ugly.
I see. Let's talk about the user interface, because I've seen a video conducted by Eric where lots of different versions of the aspect and also the interface of the Helix were done before the final concept that we all know. So how much time do you put into the interface, and what are the things that you learn over time after seeing the users interact with your designs?
We put tons and tons and tons of work into it. So Helix was redesigned from the ground up 3 times. So the one that people have right now was the 3rd iteration. The previous 2 were very, very different. And then there were iterations of those as well that also didn't look close to each other, much less. And I mean, there's a product that Ben and I have been working on since late 2017 that's still not out. And so lots of iteration, lots of design stuff, and so it can take a long time to kind of nail that. And we do a lot of testing. We'll make mock-ups in Figma, and we'll do mock-ups in Apple Keynote, because it's really fast. And so we'll show people like, hey, click on these things. This is what happens. Is this sort of making sense? Is this weird? Is this creepy? And we try to get stuff in front of friends and artists that we trust, that we know they aren't going to go blab online and tell their friends, hey, I went and I saw the new HX effects. And we get a lot of helpful feedback from them. It's really important to do it in person. It was tough to get a lot of validation during COVID. But now that we're able to actually sit down with artists and friends and say, hey, could you just try this and see if they can figure things out? And we take copious mental notes, and sometimes feedback will be helpful in such a way that you don't take the feedback from face value, but you realize, okay, there's a problem, there's a conflict here. Let's see if we can't go back and solve that. Then we get back in front of them, and they're like, oh yeah, this now makes complete sense. And you do that over and over and over and over and over again. And the hope is that you end up with a product that's easy to use and fun to use, and it's something that you see it in the corner and you're like, oh, I want to go make something cool, instead of, oh, that thing, yeah, it sounds good and it's powerful, but I don't know how much fun it is to use. So
yeah, I see.
It's very, very important.
Tactile or not tactile?
If every function had a knob, and if every parameter had a knob, every function had a button, the thing would look really, really complicated and would have a million buttons and a million knobs. So you have to find a happy medium between the two. Musicians typically want to turn a knob. They typically want to press a button and feel that click a lot of times. Sometimes it's not important, so you don't need a dedicated button. But things like save, you want to save a preset, you want to be able to press something twice and not have to go tap, did I get it? And then confirm. You just want to go tap, tap, right? Selecting presets, you want a knob. Changing models, you want a knob. Things like that. I mean, it's also a lot of it's personal preference for myself and my friends and my coworkers. So it's not necessary, but from my perspective, it's helpful to have both, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. You don't want the interface to slow you down.
Yeah. The one thing I miss and I enjoy and I miss is knobs that have ends to them. Like if I was, using my old analog pedals, I might lean down and like whack it and like slice them all the way to the max or minimum real quick, which you can't do with the encoders. But I've found that I end up using, when I'm using Helix Live, I actually use 2 extra expression pedals. So I have 3 expression pedals. So that becomes what was my bend over and like crank the delay time to max or something like that. I can then say, okay, well, now my max on the delay is, like 580 milliseconds. And when I just slam the pedal down, it just jumps to that value. And then, so it actually end up working a little bit better for me, because you can define where you want the max and min endpoints to be. And then you can use expression pedals. And if I really wanted to, I could hook it up to a physical knob. But, I just got used to using my feet, which is I'm already doing anyway.
So speaking of which, Ben, how do you fight option paralysis? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. It's funny for me, I'm designing these amp models and I'm wanting to put as much as I can into it. But as a guitar player and a creative person, my guitar rigs have changed very little over the years. Like it's always the same kind of basic setup and layout. So in one of my bands, I just have almost one preset that I do everything with, that has like 1 amp model, 1 or 2 amp models, and then all the pedals. And so when I'm actually creating, I kind of go to this one preset, and it's almost like I'm using my old analog pedal board and amplifier. And I just stop worrying about the option. Like, okay, this is it. This is what I use. And then every like 6 months, I'll change out the modulation for this one to this one. Something might happen, but I just end up treating it like I would as if I had a giant pile of gear. I just would have to decide at the beginning and then make music with it. But yeah, so that's maybe why I don't use native as much as Eric, is because I want to just, like, I'm just going to decide now. And then if I don't like it, I'm going to have to re-record stuff.
So I guess the conclusion is that it's not necessary to feel the urge to use everything. Not because you have like 2050 amps, you have to use 50 at least.
And that's where favorites come in too. So,
So I feel like a lot of our users do that, where they find what they like and they just end up coming back to that over and over again. But I'm sorry, go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, if you can find the 5 amps you like, or the 4 delays you want, or the reverbs you're constantly going to, instead of having to slog through the list to find what you want, save them as favorites. They're all there. You can put them in any order, and it's like block, there's my amp, block, there's my delay, there's my reverb. Oh, great, done. So it does require a bit of curation at the beginning. And I've done this in the studio too. I have so many soft synths, and they have so many different presets. And and I never got any music done because I was like, all right, let's pull up this plugin. Let's go through its 1,000, 1,200, presets, and like, what are these? And so I spent a month doing nothing but going through every preset in every plugin I have.
Absolutely.
And then saving them as channel strips with the EQs already preloaded, and the compression if necessary, and the routing and everything like that. And then organizing them into folders, and it was a pain. But now I can crank out a song in an hour, or like a beat, or like a framework for a song in an hour, because I know exactly I need a distorted lead. I go to my distorted lead folder, and every single one I pull up was something I had already liked enough to have saved. So then it's like, wait, do I like this one or this one? They're both awesome, and that's a great problem to have.
Yeah, I agree. That's the best way of having like your palette of sounds always ready. And after that, it's just a little bit of tweaking. But speaking of which, could you give us some advice about how to get sounds that translate well live? Because most people, they do their sounds at home, but they want those sounds to work fine or well, at least when they play live. How do you approach that problem?
Well, so there are a bunch of things you can do. One is you want to try to use... Ideally, you want to use the same playback system that you would use live, which is difficult to do if you're dealing with a backline that you don't know, you're not sure. You show up to the gig and like, oh, that's not the amp I expected. I throw through Mesa Boogies, they're only giving me a twin. That's like, how am I going to chug through that, right? Volume helps a lot. So if you're able to create your tones at a gig volume, because as soon as if you play something bedroom volume and you get it sounding great when it sounds soft, if you crank it, it could sound terrible, and vice versa. The adding a bit of ambience as well helps. So if you add even just a little bit of dynamic ambience reverb to it, that will at least give you some sort of room sound. So when you get into the venue and suddenly you have all of this reverb slapping back and forth across the hall, that won't surprise you. So there are some tips and tricks that you can do, but the big thing is to understand that the playback system in the environment that you're going to be playing in will always change, and that will have a massive impact on what you hear and what you feel and how you play too. So
yeah, I mean, this is the problem that happened before digital modelers too. I mean, in my old bands, I would take my amps and we'd play in a practice space, and we get in a venue and like, this doesn't sound as good. There's a reason why any band who can afford it has pre-production for where they get into a situation that represents the live sound. And even I remember seeing a video recently about Metallica, who is a famous user of modelers now. They set up their entire stage thing. They have their guitar techs who know how to program everything, and they run through a song like, this doesn't quite work, and then they go in and they spend like weeks doing pre-production for their show. So it's a problem that exists for everybody. And then, the people with money can take the time to fix it. And it exists whether it's digital modeling or if it's physical amps. You know, the live space is just wildly different than a recording studio or a practice space.
I was thinking exactly that. It used to happen with traditional amps too. It was the same.
Oh, yeah.
Let's go back in time. Let's go when Pod 2, the original Pod was released. I was about like 14 or 15, and I was always like amazed by that red bean. It was not the first modeler, but I consider it to be the more revolutionary. What were the keys of the success of the Pod? Why it was so popular?
I think it was because it brought the ability to record guitar well to the masses.
Mm-hmm.
Before Pod, I mean, there were existing digital solutions that they may have had an analog mic preamp built in, and so you're kind of stuck with that preamp sound. It might have had digital effects built in. It might have had an EQ as a cabinet emulator, but it didn't really sound or feel like an amp. Because it wasn't really designed to. It was designed to be used with cabinets.
Mm-hmm.
And the cabinet emulation outputs for recording were really just there sort of as a bonus. It wasn't the primary purpose of the product. And there were things like Sans Amp that actually did a remarkably good job of it. But Pod was really the first box designed specifically to record guitar that had different cabinet sounds, that had different amp sounds, that had built-in effects. It was super easy to use, one knob per function for the most part, with a couple shift functions, built-in tuner, which was really important. But then if you wanted to, you could also go and take it live, and you could connect the floorboard to it.
Mm-hmm.
And it had an editor via USB. And so if you needed to, you could even recall it via MIDI from your DAW. So you hit at the bottom and it spits out system exclusive, or it spits out messages to recall Pod. And that's why throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, almost every photo you saw of a studio, even if it's $1 million SSL desk, there's the little metal green bean, red bean on the corner. So
mm-hmm.
I was going to say, I think the Pod 2.0 models are probably about 15 to 20% of a regular Helix model. Just judging by the amount of tube stages and the things for like how the tone controls work, I would say, it's probably 10 to 20% of the DSP power were used for, like, say, an amp model for the similar Pod to Helix.
Surely, Pod didn't have the power to handle a single IR, or did it?
Not at the time, no.
Not at the time.
Impulse responses started with the Sony DPS777.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was NAMM 2002, and it was like a $7,000 convolution reverb box.
Wow. It was reverb at the beginning, not cabinets. Cabinets came later. And also I wanted to know, the amp part on the Pod was like component modeling too?
Yes.
Kind of. It was more coarse. It was, there might have been one tube simulator was doing most of the preamp, and then you could adjust levels and EQs before and after to kind of push it into shape. And then one might have been doing the power amp, and you'd use that to push it into shape. It was the same idea, but instead of being able to measure after every few components, you would have to measure just a chunk and then another chunk.
Okay, I understand. That probably is easier for a computer to handle.
Yeah, it was just what could run on the available hardware at the time.
Absolutely. I remember the video games I had at that time, and it has nothing to do with the... yeah. Okay. So, actually, speaking of video games, do you believe that Pod X3 could run the Doom game?
No.
No? No?
Pod X3 couldn't. Pod X3 could. Helix could.
Helix could?
Helix could.
I don't think anyone did that. You guys should do that. You should run Doom on Helix. So
we'll just all of our users be like, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you give us this amp, that amp? People just be mad that we're not doing what they want.
If you hold Shift Alt and you turn the gain knob, you access to the secret Doom game. That would be cool. Yep. So when the Pod 2 came out, people often treated it like it was a regular pedal, which led to people using the Pod into the input of an already distorted amp, and sometimes with the treble all the way up. It was sometimes very chaotic. Do you think that people are now more educated about what emulator does, what a modeling device does?
Yeah, I would think. I'd say that they are. because I think the people who are in this world, there's lots of information out there on forums and YouTube videos and things that people post. So I think if someone is into this world, they do understand kind of what this is for and what's going on. Now that everyone has a studio in their house with their laptop, and they know that, okay, I can plug into this and it just makes the sound of the guitar amp, and I don't have to worry about other things.
I think you're onto something, Mike. You just like are making if you run pod into an amp, that could be a whole new genre of music.
I mean, I saw people, and there used to be modes on some of them where it's like, what are you plugging this into? 112, 212, 412, direct, Remember that? I forget, was that Pod XT?
Output modes all the way through HD.
Okay. And so that was EQ that was applied to kind of correct the fact that you were plugging into something that wasn't a flat response. And it kind of worked, it kind of didn't, it just depended. But, and I know people who did run it into amps, and they just crafted their tones that way. They would EQ the amp to be more neutral, and then they knew they were running an amp into an amp, but they had the knowledge of what they were doing, so they at least were able to get something that they liked and was new and unique. But yeah, so I feel like there's less people like, I don't know how to use this now. People are really, if they're going to use Helix or any of the upper end level amp modelers, they know exactly the rig they're going to use it in and how to configure it more or less correctly.
Absolutely. And also, I guess that's why it took like 20 years for the FR monitors to become a product.
Yeah.
There were studio monitors ahead, before people would bring studio monitors to coffee shop gigs. Like, what's the flattest, most accurate thing I can get? Well, you get studio monitors, and now there are really expensive high-end PA systems and like floor wedges. They're 10, 20 grand a piece that do a really good job too. So FRFR is sort of a weird misnomer anyway. So and perception is 9/10 of the law, if I can mix metaphors. So
I don't know if that was me.
So the public's idea of what an FRFR isn't necessarily what traditionally FRFRs have been. So right now people think it's something that looks like it's basically a flat speaker that looks like a guitar cabinet, and that's fine. I'll take that.
So there were like many products that clearly followed the path of the pod, and like Digitech Genesis, Behringer, V-Amp, like the Yamaha DG-Stomp, Johnson J-Station. Do you have any contact with those products?
From what I understand, the Johnson J-Station, and they were affiliated with Digitech. They were being developed at the same time as Pod, and I believe the Johnson amp was being developed at the same time as the AX212. Line 6 just happened to get it out a year earlier, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just a little.
One of the products you mentioned is like straight up comical ripoff of Pod. But I didn't have any of those. I had a JMP1, I had a SansAmp, which both predate Pod. I had a Pod 2.0, I had a Pod rack, but as soon as I could go into the computer with Amp Farm, I did. So I was Amp Farm and Echo Farm. That was my guitar tone for over a decade. So I've been software from the very, very beginning, and I have hardware to play around with, but for all of the Stereo Series recording stuff, it's always been software for me.
I remember that in the 90s, most of the modelers I could try sounded like a little bit under a blanket or boxy. And later, that seemed to disappear because we have this new generation of Helix, Fractal, Kemper, that the sound has improved a lot. What did those old units sound like that, like boxy and under a blanket? Is there a technical explanation for that?
Well, I think there's two things to consider. One, I think when people were designing them, if you put a guitar in a mix, when you play guitar, you want to sound big and full. But when you get into the studio and you put it in a mix, a lot of times the first thing an engineer will do will put a high pass on it to get rid of some of the super lows, and then the low pass to kind of maybe get rid of the fizzle because they don't want it to interfere. So it's almost like they were giving you that the engineer had kind of limited it a little bit to fit into the mix, which is why, I think specifically like something like, the Boston, the Schultz Rockman had that kind of like really mid-rangey focused sound, because you could just put that in a mix and it would sit, you'd always be able to hear it, but it didn't interfere with the bass. It was. So I think there's a little bit of that. And two, I think a lot of those early modelers, weren't sampling at even like 44.1 or like sparkly highs as a way to safeguard it sounding really ugly and harsh on the high.
I understand.
So I think it was probably those two things. And then once DSP improved, you could do things at 48K. You had, you know, good oversampling for when things distorted. Then you could kind of get the extended high frequency. That, fair enough. A lot of times it gets recorded in the DAW, and then of course in mix, you just put the low pass in and take it out about everything out about 5K anyway. So it's a weird world we live in.
But that's interesting. And how do you see the future of modeling? What we can expect? Will we see something related to AI?
I think a lot of companies are looking at it pretty seriously. There are all sorts of really cool things that AI could potentially accomplish in this space. The big question is whether or not it will be transparent enough for users to embrace it and go, this is actually better than going in and turning knobs, and this is better than me going in and taking what I hear in my brain and trying to replicate it. And it's still going to take a while for AI to figure out how to get what's in your head into silicon and into zeros and ones. It does a really good job of emulating and replicating existing things, but what exists in the real world isn't necessarily what people hear in their head either. So if somebody goes, hey, I want the sound from from Van Halen's Panama. So is the AI going to pull in what you think Panama sounds like? Is it going to make it sound like what the album it sounds like in the album soloed? Is it going to go online? Is it going to do stem splitting, figure out what the guitar part in that is, and then pull that in, and you play it by itself, and because the rest of the band isn't there, you'll be like, this sounds terrible, because the solo track sounded terrible. So there are some hurdles to overcome. It's stuff that we talk about a lot. I think there are other things that beyond, or not beyond, but tangential to AI that could certainly be improved. Things that pieces of friction that we see people running into all the time that we could solve that doesn't require AI. That we're also looking into. But I think the future looks really bright, especially for this space. There's all sorts of really cool things happening. As long as people are actually pushing the technology instead of copying everybody else, then we'll actually get somewhere.
Okay, and my last questions. Do you think that someday we will have to pay thousands of dollars for a pod in good condition?
I don't know.
No, because there's still so many out there.
Okay.
Great working condition. If they were rare, if they were harder to get, then I can totally see that. Yeah.
Do you know how much marketing had to pay for the Pod 1.0 that's in the museum now?
No.
That'd be a good... So we have a museum inside our office of all the products that we had, and we realized that no one had a Pod 1.0.
Oh.
So we had to go purchase
Of course.
a Pod 1.0 to put into our product museum, because I think the ones that were around were all belonged to people who either left the company or they got destroyed or they got given to, like, oh, we have Pod 2.0, we have Pod XC, I can give this 1.0 to like my friend's kid, you know, something. So we realized we didn't have any of those. So I don't know. It might be, you know, there might be a museum of ancient guitar technology. You may want one, though.
Including the paper 2-foot prototypes of HX Stomp. I've saw it in a video too.
I don't know where they are. I think we did a remodel during COVID and they disappeared. You guys still have the origami Illustrator file. It's just printouts.
Yeah.
Then, Eric, it was such a pleasure to talk to you and learn so many things. Thank you. See you soon.
Fun times. All right. Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Mickey.
Thank you.